Last week, we boarded a plane from Los Angeles to Australia, where we were headed for the World Time Attack Challenge, the single largest time attack race in the world. A few months prior, we shipped out the Ferrari 244 GTK, a project car we've been building right here on this channel that features a turbocharged Honda engine and a minimalized weight. We spent a few days with our friends at Haltech, where we tied up any loose ends on the car and then strapped it to the dyno. And from there, Scott worked his magic to make sure it had a safe tune and had flat shifting set up. Now, it's time to head to the track. After a much-needed night of sleep, we found ourselves back at Haltech bright and early on Wednesday morning. The 244 GTK was right where we left it, still strapped down to Haltech's dyno, begging for whatever comes next. Surprisingly though, somehow it feels like we're ahead of schedule. We put in enough work yesterday that there's not a ton left to accomplish today before we send the car over to the racetrack. On the other hand though, we don't want to be dyno hogs and want to make sure that anybody else who needs to use this thing has access to it. So we figured why not unload the car, push it outside into the beautiful Australian spring weather, and figure out what we can add to our list even if it's only to cross it off. We've got our T's crossed and our I's dotted, but it's also easy to forget those lowercase j's as well. But with that said, after some time spent thinking about it, most of what we could come up with were simply small aesthetic fixes. With a huge photo and video shoot planned on track this evening, we wanted to make sure the car was ready for prime time. We just have a short list here that we've got. Not really much left on it. This is the entirety of what we need in order to pull off the day. Scott here at Haltech is going to do a little bit of beep booping, make the dash work the way we want it to, make sure we have the proper fail-safe set up so that I don't blow this thing up. And realistically, I think beyond that, we'll knock these small things out and we'll be ready to head over to the track this evening for the media shoot, video shoot, all that type of stuff for World Time Attack. So I think Oxer is going to do the courtesy of driving us around. So we'll catch up with you guys in a few. So while Oxer drove us around to acquire small bolts and screws, as well as seeking out a very particular type of black cloth tape, the rest of the gang stayed behind tidying up the car. By the time we returned, Scott, aka Tuning Fork himself, had arrived and was willing to donate his entire morning to setting up the car just the way I wanted it. And it's hard to put into words just how much I actually appreciate his and the rest of the Haltech team's efforts, because as you'll see later in this episode, Scott's work right here literally saves my engine.
First, you've got all the engine protection stuff set up in the ECU now, so there's going to be,
sweet.
I've set 2 levels up. So the first level, it's got a 4,000 RPM rev limiter, so if something happens, if it overheats or if it's something that you can get back to the pits,
Sure.
no dramas. There's also another one that's got a 2,000 rev limiter, so if it rev limiting at 2,000, you need to have a quick look at the dash and figure out what's going on and choose whether, realistically, it's only going to be a lack of oil pressure is pretty much what will cause it. So if it's rev limiting at $2,000, you can choose to turn it off.
So of course it comes as no surprise that an aftermarket standalone ECU would have a limp mode and fail-safes, but having 2 separate ones to help identify different problems goes above and beyond. But Scott wasn't done there either.
So what we're going to try and do is, we've got overrides on the buttons in this car, so the idea that after you've gone out for a session to come in, it's nice and hot, you don't really want to just shut the engine down straight away. Because this thing's got an electronic water pump and electronic thermofans, we can set up an override so that you turn that on, you switch the car off, but there's still water circulating and the fans are still turning on and still going to cool the engine down. But you don't want it to get too cold, which is also a problem with these things where you've got big fans and water pumps. So what the plan is that we're going to bring it all the way down to about 70 degrees Celsius or 180-ish degrees Fahrenheit. Then everything will turn off and you know it's ready for the next session straight away.
And that merely scratches the surface of the tricks Scott has up his sleeve. Meanwhile, I was working on the dash. Back stateside, I was having problems with reflections, both off of the aluminum panels and the tape I applied to it. So Oxer and I found some matte black vinyl to put in its place to kill those reflections once we're on track here in Australia. Passive maintenance.
There you go.
Still lined up?
Yep.
From there, we brought the car back inside one more time, deciding that it was probably smart to get underneath it and make sure that following our dyno pulls, there were no new leaks. After combing through the engine bay thoroughly, we could only find bits of residue. We deduced that this must be from our first startup and all of the oil that came out of the exhaust, and thus we feel pretty confident moving forward that the car should be leak-free. With that, the car is officially done. It's ready to head to Sydney Motorsport Park. And as much fun as it would be to drive it there, I've heard nothing but terrible things about how not lenient Australian cops are when it comes to their automotive laws. So we're going to throw this thing onto a flatbed and trailer it over. But as luck would have it, or perhaps fate in this case, that's when the skies opened up and it began to rain. A glimpse at the forecast showed it wasn't going to get any better for the rest of the evening. In fact, it was only going to get worse, with lightning picking up in the background and a roaring thunder rolling overhead. Any plans that we had for filming or photographing on the track were quickly getting washed away. However, seemingly always the man with a plan, Ian Baker, Mr. World Time Attack himself, had a backup plan in place. When we arrived at the track, an event-sized several thousand square foot tent had already been erected to shield us from the weather. Inside would be a gathering of the event's top cars, some of the fastest time attack machines on planet Earth, brought over from all over the world. And then, for one reason or another, there was my Ferrari as well. Suddenly, we found ourselves surrounded by some of the coolest cars I have ever seen in my life.
Dude, look at this! Yeah, this is fucking race car shit. The Imposter Syndrome is super real right now.
In both honesty and transparency, I was suddenly doubting my own accomplishments and skills. I mean, yeah, I was here on the other side of the world with my car amongst some of the most impressive drivers and machines anywhere, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't belong here. I have a garage-built car, and it's being driven by a guy with garage-built experience. I'm entrenched with teams that have spent millions of dollars and have given everything to be here, but here I am with just some friends trying to chase a dream, which is cool, but somehow feels undeserving. But on the flip side, I suppose it's important to remember that we all start somewhere, and I suppose I'm just beyond fortunate to have my first event be the biggest and best one that exists. Despite the way I felt, though, the community made sure I felt welcome. And with that, the night came to an end, and we took the car over to our garage. We locked it up tight for the night and got some sleep, because tomorrow, we drive. While the World Time Attack Challenge doesn't officially begin for another 24 hours, Thursday is practice day for all of the drivers, and for me, this is where it starts. The Ferrari will make its way onto the tarmac today with me behind the wheel, and it feels like this right here is what we've been working towards for years. all of the hard work that all of my friends have put in since we landed on this continent adds up to this right here. But before we actually get out on the track in the car, there are a few things we've got to knock out first. We've got to get registered to make sure that I've got my credentials and the rest of the team has theirs too. Pit passes, crew passes, and parking passes to make sure we can all get to and from the track as needed for the next few days. And then there's the driver's meeting, which is to make sure we have at least some idea of what on earth we're actually doing out there on track. Oh, and I almost forgot. There's one other critical detail. We've got to go through scrutineering. If you've been following along with this build series, you know before we ever left for Australia that I put an immense amount of effort in to make sure that we would qualify for their rules. Most of the events we're going to participate in stateside are self-tech, which means there aren't really any eyeballs on the car until something goes wrong. But when it comes to Australia, they take their scrutineering very seriously. If the car doesn't comply down to the smallest details, we either have to fix it or we're out. So I made sure to read that rulebook thoroughly before we shipped the car out, and thankfully there was only one small change we had to make. They wanted to see some roll bar padding next to my helmet. They even thoroughly checked all of my racing equipment, like the helmet itself, along with my racing suit, shoes, gloves, and socks. But everything checked out, and they signed off on the car, specifically complimenting the RS Motorsport roll cage as one of the best they've ever seen, hands down. I wish I could say I'm surprised, but we kind of expect that when it comes to our boy Riley. As I got ready to get into the car, the rest of the guys got the car ready by making sure we had things like tightened lug nuts and removed pins for our onboard fire system. As far as goals for our first session, it's really simple. Session 1 is solely to prepare for Session 2. I'll be listening and smelling for any potential problems and feeling for any vibrations that I'm not expecting, but otherwise, I'm not going to be pushing the car all that hard. I know some of you are thinking that sounds completely stupid and like a waste of time, but it's baby steps here. I want to make sure the car is ready for prime time, and we've got one day to pull that off. My initial reactions, the car feels pretty good. The only obvious problem right away is that the splitter is regularly skipping on the asphalt. Listen as we go through the next turn. Clearly, that's not going to work, but as far as fixes go, that's relatively simple, so I'm not too stressed about it. Otherwise, the car feels planted and confident, so I stayed out and continued to get a feel for the car. And I know you guys are begging me for flying laps of this thing, and we're gonna get there, I promise. But the session was over as quickly as it began, so I pulled back into the pits for us to collect tire pressures and tire temperatures so we could better understand how the car is behaving. That's Session 1 crossed off the list, and it was a resounding success. But we're far from finished with any important work. From here, the car gets yet another once-over to find out if anything is shaking itself loose. We pulled back into the garage so we could put it up on jack stands and take a look. But it was here that I did feel, admittedly, somewhat emotional. Yeah, we've turned laps in this car before, but I just turned laps in Australia. And on an FIA Grade 2 circuit at that. I don't want to get too excited, but honestly, it feels like we're cooking with fire. The boys gave me the rundown on how the car looked from afar out on track, and aside from the splitter tapping the pavement, everybody said it looked fantastic. And we weren't the only ones filled with excitement either. Everybody wanted to hear how our first session went, starting with our friends at HB Academy and continuing on with what felt like everybody else with a microphone. There was a bit of a buzz going on within our pit and paddock. To put it simply though, this event was already shaping up to be everything it had been promised to be. Clearly, the cars that were surrounding us were incredible, and the community was just as special. But now I can say Sydney Motorsport Park circuit is also absolutely bonkers. That turn 1 everybody says separates the boys from the men? Well, they're right, and I'm eager to get back out there and hit it again. Luckily, it's time already. In Session 2, the idea is to lean on the car a little bit harder. Now for those somehow new to this series, I've only driven this car 2 times previously, and I only have about 30 minutes of seat time in total, so I'm learning my comfort level with the car, its limits, and I'm learning a track I've never driven prior. And aside from that splitter, things felt good on my outlap, but on my first flyer I encountered a problem. Just a few turns into lap number 1 and at peak confidence, the car went into limp mode. The dash informed me that we had a lean condition, but thanks to those safe modes that Scott had programmed in yesterday, I knew that we hadn't hurt the engine. Scott and this Haltech just saved my ass, and the cost of a new engine. In limp mode, we're limited to 4,000 RPM, but that allowed me to bring the car the rest of the way around the track, back to the pit, so we could take a look. We assumed there had to be plenty of fuel left in the car, and there was, around 4 gallons in fact. But it did remind us that it'd be a good idea to get the fuel level sender set up so that the dash would tell me. As a result, there were only a few things that could cause a lean condition like the one that we experienced. On one hand, perhaps despite the fact that it had nearly a half tank of fuel, we were experiencing fuel starvation. In short, meaning we have a fuel pickup issue which would necessitate a surge tank. On the other hand, Scott was mildly worried that we might be experiencing a lean condition as part of the tune, something we didn't see on the dyno that instead was rearing its head in on-track conditions. So he took a deep dive and looked at the logs. Meanwhile, though, there was something crazy happening in our garage. I was tied up in a conversation with some suspension engineers when Keiichi Tsuchiya himself came to look at the 244 GTK. Honestly, I couldn't believe my eyes when I looked over and saw his iconic green racing suit right next to my car. Now, if you don't know who Tsuchiya is, he is literally the father of drifting as a sport. He is a 2-time class winner at Le Mans, and rumor has it that Initial D is based on him. He's known as the Drift King, and he is quite literally, in every respect, a legend. And yet, somehow, here he was, standing over my car taking photos with his cell phone. I just could not believe it. But I guess that's World Time Attack Challenge for you. This was such a special moment, in fact, that longtime friend Larry Chen had to ask me how I felt on camera after it happened. I expected a lot to happen at World Time Attack Challenge, but I didn't expect to meet a hero. But just as humbling was the fact that there were others at this event just as excited to meet me, and that blows my mind. It's day 1, just 2 sessions in, and I'm already having the time of my life. It could turn south at this moment, and I'd still feel some sense of satisfaction. After all, we made it. We're here 8,000 miles from home on the other side of the world. We've turned laps, we've shaken hands, and the car feels amazing. I am, by every measure, on top of the world. And it's worth mentioning that I wouldn't be here doing this if it weren't for you guys watching along. Session 3, though, was cut short. I was black flagged due to an apparent fuel leak coming from the back of the car. But none of us were really surprised. We did just fill the tank all the way up to combat our lack of a surge tank. Everyone scrambled as soon as I pulled back in to see if we could find an immediate solution to get me back out on track. I was flagged on my outlap, meaning there was quite a bit of time left in the session for us to get the car back out on track and gather important data to make sure that the car is ready for prime time tomorrow, when the official competition starts. At least, that's what everybody else was thinking. But honestly, I was in a full-blown panic. I sat in the car in total silence, solitarily facing a much bigger issue than anyone else was even aware of. Everyone else was working to get the car back out on track, but I had to put a stop to it, and you'll see why here. Watch closely what happens to the shifter just seconds before I grab it coming out of turn 3. Did you catch it? Because it was subtle, but the transmission shifted from second to third before I ever made contact with the shifter. I told myself that it must have been a fluke and continued on, but it happened again. A shift from second to third occurred without any input from me, so I let off and I brought it in. Solving the mysterious fuel leak was going to be simple. It just required a bit of basic re-engineering on our fuel cell vent line. Moving it to the other side of the car would circumvent the issue, but that's just one problem solved. On the other hand, we've had that front splitter dragging on the ground all day long, and after looking underneath, it's become pretty clear that the issue is bigger than anticipated. The carbon is beginning to come apart and the core is exposed, and if we don't do something about it, the splitter's going to come apart. And without the front arrow, we're going to be in a seriously troubling position, even if we find a solution for the gearbox. And that, of course, brings us back to the elephant in the room. We took a look at the data logs to find out if there was any chance that our new flat shift setup was contributing to the gearbox issue, but the reality is, all the flat shifting does is cut throttle. It's not doing anything to shift gears itself. Instead, the most likely cause lies in the way that sequential gearboxes actually function. We've decided that the second gear dog ring must be damaged in some capacity. How that actually happened, we're not entirely sure, but some form of misshift must have damaged the teeth, causing an engagement issue that yields the shifting problem. Now, to simplify that, HP Academy has this very simple video that shows a dog ring moving back and forth between gears. These teeth engage on the gears themselves and transmit power out of the transmission. If these teeth get rounded off, the transmission can attempt to try to shift itself out of gear, and that is most likely what's happening. So what do we do about it? Well, right now, our best solution is to simply hope for the best. Perhaps giving it a clutch kick or two out on track might hammer the dogs back into shape and give us better engagement, but otherwise, it's a crapshoot. And if it does somehow get worse, well, then we're in some deep trouble. A sequential gearbox can't be held into gear like an H-pattern box can. And if second gear is gone entirely, it becomes very difficult to shift through, given the fact that you can't skip the gear without clutching. And if you clutch, well, the gearbox doesn't like that and you risk damaging other dogs. And so, before the competition has even began, that's where we stand. It feels like we might be dead in the water without even knowing it yet. The day went from such high highs to a newfound low in this project. All we can do is see what tomorrow brings. It's hard not to be catastrophically upset until I stop and remind myself one more time that we made it. We're here. We did everything that we set out to do. And even if this is it, I'm happy.
From early days on the forums where we were just like literally talking shit and having a good time, to what Mike has been able to achieve is crazy to think like where we started out, from Rusty being a car that came to fruition due to an accident, and then, you know, Rusty went through so many iterations, whether it was the complete rusting of the body to the roof chop to the tube chassis finish of Rusty, you know, and the builds that followed that. Just awesome to see all of the hard work paying off, you know, and to see him like in Australia and the car in Australia. So cool. So cool. I've never been to World Time Attack, and to be honest, I probably wouldn't have attended any just because it is so far away. Like, it took me on average to drive from Melbourne to Sydney would be like a 8.5, 9 hour drive. But as soon as Mike said the car's coming, I was like, sweet, lock it in. I'm coming too. You have to. We're family. Feel like Dominic Toretto. Dude, I just hope he keeps doing what he's doing. Like, I'm just so happy that he's been able to like hone what the dream for all of us is. That's just building cool shit on a daily basis. Because not many of us actually get that opportunity. And I don't know that it's opportunity, to be honest, because Mike's worked his ass off to get to this point. So, yeah, that's the dream. He's living it, which is awesome. Got nothing but love.
But I guess we will, I don't know, we'll drive it anyway. We'll break it if we have to, and I don't know, hopefully it'll still go kind of fast with no second gear.